All right. Hello there. So this is take two, and the world is upside down, crisscrossed, and confused because people. So there's a lot of different topics to talk about. I could talk about genocides that we're not allowed to call genocides from countries that we're not supposed to criticize. And this is also happening while my female audience members are in decline. It's at least according to Spotify, mostly a male audience at this point in time. And what way to bring the ladies back than to discuss Ronald Reagan's economic legacy, Reaganomics or Trickle Down and its effects. So, yes, a very, very bold and effective strategy to bring the ladies back to my little podcast here. But anyway, welcome to another episode of Critical Wade Theory, where I sometimes dissect political history, economics, and the legacy of influential figures, and I occasionally do things like movie and TV show reviews. Every great once in a while, I have a guest on or something like that. But today we're diving into the policies of Ronald Reagan and the long lasting impact of his economic philosophy, famously known as Reaganomics or trickle down economics, or sometimes even voodoo economics. These policies have been both praised and criticized for their effects on the US economy, on income inequality, and national debt. So let's break down what Reaganomics was all about and what the real outcomes were, not the sort of mythic outcomes. So, what is the core idea of Reaganomics? Well, I'm not an economist. I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert, but I've pooled some information here for your convenience and for mine. So, Reagan's economic policy, again often dubbed voodoo economics by critics, was rooted in what is called supply side economics. This approach aimed to stimulate economic growth by reducing taxes, particularly for businesses and wealthy individuals, with the expectation that the benefits would eventually trickle down to the rest of society. The idea was simple. If businesses had more capital, they could theoretically invest more, create more jobs, and increase wages, which would benefit everyone. Reagan famously believed that a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, we don't know what he actually believed, but that's what he said. And that basically means that as the economy grew, everyone would eventually prosper. This philosophy defined much of his presidency, but the real world effects were mixed. As I often joke, they might as well call it trickle down effects because it's like when you're done pissing out a urinal, it's like those little those little drops that accidentally fall. That's kind of what trickles down for some folks. But you know, at the core of the idea that was presented was economic growth and success. So on the surface, Reaganomics delivered significant economic growth for the businesses, especially big businesses. During his time in office, the U.S. GDP grew, from what I understand, inflation dropped, and unemployment decreased. Supporters of Reagan argue that his tax cuts spurred investment, revitalized businesses, and helped expand the economy. And you know what? To be fair, that's apparently true. I was just a child at the time, so I can't say for sure what was even happening in the world when I was younger. Based on my anecdotal experience, I was too busy watching cartoons and stuff. But many who endorsed Reaganomics believe that cutting taxes on the wealthy and corporations encouraged investments that would lead to job creation and wage increases. For many Americans, this period of economic growth seemed like a success story, reinforcing the appeal of Reagan's policies. Well, I don't know if maybe I'm being too generous for saying many Americans, because it did have many critics as well, let's be fair. And that brings us to the dark side, which is about the wealth inequality. That's the other side to the coin. So while the economy grew overall, the wealth generated disproportionately benefited the wealthy. The middle and lower income earners saw relatively smaller gains compared to the wealthy. Income inequality widened, and the gap between the rich and poor increased sharply during Reagan's presidency. So critics of Reaganomics like economist Joseph Stiglitz argued that policies that only benefit the top earners can have long-term negative effects. Stiglitz points out that when people at the bottom of the income scale cannot reach their full potential, it weakens demand in the economy and slows future growth. So, yeah, basically, I mean, it's vague the way I just worded it, right? That's how the economists out there would probably word it. But put it this way: if you don't have money, you're gonna have a harder time making money because as the saying goes, it takes money to make money, and that is quite often true. That's why if you really look behind the scenes of a lot of these rags to riches kind of tales, often what happens is that somebody was there to help them out, or maybe they benefited from some government program, even if it's some minimal thing that boosted their livelihood or something like that. So it's rarely the case where somebody you know starts off selling melons on the freeway or oranges on the freeway, and what do you know, suddenly they have a massive orange juice factory or something. That's I don't want to say that could never happen, but it's usually something a little more complex than just doing a little bit of hard work here and there, and wow, suddenly it just takes away like a or it just is like a runaway freight train of success. So there's also the issue of budget deficits and national debt. One of the major criticisms of Reaganomics is its effect on the federal budget and national debt. While taxes were cut, government spending, particularly on so called defense, rose sharply. The tax cuts did not generate enough revenue to offset the loss in government income. So basically, Reagan didn't do that well at math, basic mathematics. Now, I suck at math, but even I know that, you got to make more money than you spend. That's one of the core principles of economics, but maybe he just didn't care about that. So consequently, the federal budget deficit increased and the national debt tripled. It tripled during Reagan's presidency. Sorry, I kind of stumbled with the word tripled there. Um, but but anyway, it's just that's what took off like a runaway freight train. The national debt and the budget deficit, two separate things actually. The national debt is like the specific amount owed to nations, and the budget deficit is the difference between what the government spends and what it takes in through taxation, or however you want to phrase that. But according to many economic experts or reports, um, this is including from the International Monetary Fund. These deficits and debt burdens have had long term effects on the US economy. Now, I know some people out there criticize the IMF, but I think they're right on this one. So, Reagan's policies are often cited as a turning point in America's fiscal wealth, one that saw an escalation of debt that has continued in subsequent decades, and there really aren't that many signs of it slowing down that much. So, when a president really wants to implement something like Reaganomics, they get right back into accumulating even more of that national debt. So there were some mixed results for the middle class as well. While the wealthy benefited, the promise of trickle down economics did not fully materialize for middle and lower income earners. Real wages stagnated, and many workers didn't see the job creation they were promised. For the average American worker, Reagan's policies didn't translate into the kind of prosperity that was envisioned and that was promoted as being sort of like a paradise. A paradise? God damn, I can't talk today. Paradise. So, anyway, many argue that this stagnation in wages continues to affect, that's AFFECT, the middle class to this day, exacerbating economic challenges faced by millions of working class Americans. So, the mythology doesn't quite match the reality. So, Reaganomics remains a highly debated topic in economic and political circles. That's where, you know, people actually talk about these things rather than just yell at each other like you see on the TV. Um, well, I suppose they can still yell at each other pretty much anywhere, but theoretically, people can calmly discuss these things. But, on one hand, it led to significant economic growth, lowered inflation, and reduced unemployment. On the other, it increased income inequality, expanded the national debt, and left many working class Americans without the benefits they were promised. So Ronald Reagan's legacy is considered, conservative. It's one of the things that makes him an icon in the eyes of conservative, people across the United States and, well, presumably throughout the world. So his legacy is secure among certain people as a positive sort of figure, but the true impact of his economic policies is definitely more complicated. While the wealthiest Americans benefited most from his policies, many middle class and lower income citizens found themselves left behind. And, of course, one of the solutions that both Republicans and corporate Democrats sort of clamor to is to cut benefits for, those who have been left behind, leave them even further behind, I guess. But anyway, as we reflect on the long term effects of Reaganomics, it's clear that the debate over its fairness and effectiveness will continue for years to come, so long as there are people who care to discuss it. So, thanks for tuning into this episode. As always, stay curious, ask questions, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history, politics, and economics. And you can hear me fumble words, Who doesn't like to see or hear people fumble, you know? That's one of the reasons people go to, stock car races, They want to see they want to see the car crash, in terms of, the show. It's a mixed bag. I mess up sometimes when I'm talking. So, um it has a human element to my show. So, until next time, keep questioning the narratives. And remember, history is always worth revisiting, but you might want to bring along a barf bag.